My husband looked straight at me, laughed in front of an entire room full of executives, and said, It's just Deborah's little hobby." The table erupted with laughter. After 35 years of marriage. That was how Richard Elliott introduced the business I had spent years building with my own hands. I smiled because I didn't want anyone to see how badly it hurt. 3 months later, his company filed for bankruptcy. But that wasn't the most shocking part of the story. The real surprise was what happened to the woman everyone thought would fail first. If this story resonates with you already, I'd love for you to hit like and subscribe and stay with me until the end. And please tell me in the comments, what would you have done if your spouse laughed at your dream in front of everyone? Also, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. I read every comment. And hearing your stories means more to me than you know. If you had met me 10 years ago, you probably would have described me as a typical American wife nearing retirement. Reliable, quiet, forgettable. At least, that's how I often felt. My name is Deborah Elliott, and I live in Columbus, Ohio. At 62 years old, I had spent more than half my life building a home, raising children, supporting my husband's career, and making sacrifices that nobody seemed to notice anymore. Especially my husband. Richard Elliott and I had been married for 35 years. When we first met, he was ambitious, charming, and full of dreams. Back then, I loved listening to him talk about the future. He wanted to build a successful company. He wanted financial security. He wanted a life that neither of us had growing up. And together, we chased those dreams. At least that's what I thought. The truth was that somewhere along the way, Richard's dreams became the only dreams that mattered. When our children were young, I left my job as an administrative assistant to stay home with them. It wasn't a sacrifice I regretted. I loved being a mother. I packed lunches. I attended school plays. I stayed awake during fevers. I drove to soccer practices. I helped with homework. Meanwhile, Richard worked longer and longer hours. Every promotion he earned became a victory for the entire family. At least that's what everyone said. Nobody asked what I had given up to help make those promotions possible. Not even Richard. Especially not Richard. As the years passed, his confidence grew. Then it became pride. Then it became something else. Something colder. By the time we entered our 50s, he rarely asked for my opinion anymore. He informed me. He corrected me. Sometimes he even talked to me like I was one of his employees. I didn't like it. But after decades of marriage, you learn how to ignore certain things. Or at least you tell yourself that you do. The children eventually moved away. The house became quieter. Too quiet. For the first time in years, I found myself wondering what was left for me. Not as a wife, not as a mother, as Deborah, one rainy Saturday afternoon. I stumbled across an online video about handmade candles. It seemed simple enough, a hobby. Just something to pass the time. I ordered a beginner's kit. Then another. Soon, our garage was filled with jars, fragrance oils, labels, wax, and notebooks full of ideas. For the first time in years, I felt excited about something that belonged entirely to me. I named my little business Elliott HomeSense. The name sounded professional, hopeful, like something that might actually matter. At first, I sold a few candles to neighbors, then friends of friends. People kept coming back. They liked the scents. They liked the packaging. They liked the personal notes I included with every order. Every sale made me smile, not because of the money, because someone had chosen something I created, something that came from my hands, something that was mine. Richard never understood that. The first time I told him I wanted to turn the hobby into a real business, he laughed. Not cruelly, not at first, just dismissively. Debbie, nobody gets rich making candles. I remember smiling. I don't want to get rich. Then what's the point? I didn't know how to answer that, because the point wasn't money. The point was purpose. But Richard never seemed to understand the difference. As months passed, my business slowly grew. Nothing dramatic. A few online orders, a few local markets, some repeat customers. Enough to make me proud. Not enough to impress my husband. Whenever anyone asked what I was doing, Richard always found a way to make it sound ridiculous. She's keeping busy. It's her retirement hobby. She likes pretending she's an entrepreneur. Every comment sounded harmless by itself. Together, they became something heavier, something painful. The worst part was that he genuinely believed he was being funny. One evening, while I was carefully packing orders at the kitchen table, Richard walked in carrying a briefcase. He glanced at the boxes. "How much did you make today?" I told him. His eyebrows lifted, then he laughed. "That's it." I felt my stomach tighten. It was a good day? For a lemonade stand, maybe? I stared down at the shipping labels. Richard continued. "You know, Deborah, business is a lot harder than people think." I looked up. "What does that mean?" "It means running a real company isn't arts and crafts." I didn't answer, because I knew where the conversation would go. It always went to the same place. His company, his success, his intelligence, his importance, and somehow my lack of all three. The truth was that Richard's company had become his entire identity. He wasn't just proud of being successful. He needed to feel superior, and that distinction would eventually destroy him. But I didn't know that yet. Back then, I was still trying to earn his respect, still trying to prove that what I was building mattered. One afternoon, my best friend Sarah Mitchell stopped by for coffee. She noticed stacks of inventory lining the garage walls. Her eyes widened. "Deborah, this is getting serious." I laughed. "Not according to Richard." Sarah rolled her eyes. "Forget Richard. That's easier said than done." She studied me carefully. "You know what bothers me?" "What?" "You still need his approval." The words hit harder than I expected. Because she was right. I hated admitting it. But she was right. After 35 years, part of me still wanted Richard to look at my work and say he was proud of me. Just once. Just one time. Instead, every new achievement seemed to irritate him. The more excited I became, the more dismissive he became. I couldn't understand why. Not then, but looking back, I think I know. Success had always been Richard's territory. His identity, his source of power. And somewhere, deep inside, he didn't like seeing me build something that belonged only to me, especially something he couldn't control. I remember standing alone in the garage one evening after finishing a long day of work. Rows of candles filled the shelves. Boxes were stacked neatly in corners. The room smelled like vanilla, cedarwood, and lavender. I felt proud, not because I had made a fortune, not because I had proven anyone wrong. I felt proud because for the first time in years, I had created something for myself. What I didn't realize was that while my little business was slowly growing, Richard's carefully constructed empire was beginning to crack. Tiny fractures, invisible at first, easy to ignore, but they were there. And soon, those cracks would become impossible to hide. The dinner party happened on a Thursday evening in early September. I remember the date because I spent 3 full days preparing for it. Richard was hosting several important clients, potential investors, and senior executives from his company. According to him, it was one of the most important networking events of the year. That meant the pressure was on, not for Richard, for me. For 35 years, I had played the role of the supportive corporate wife. I knew exactly what was expected. The house had to be spotless. The food had to be perfect. The wine had to be chilled. The atmosphere had to feel effortless, even though it never was. By noon, I was already exhausted. I had prepared appetizers, arranged flowers, polished glasses, and checked every room twice. Richard walked through the house shortly before the guests arrived. He glanced around, nodded once, then checked his watch. No thank you, no appreciation, just a brief inspection. As if I were a hotel employee making sure everything met company standards. I shouldn't have been surprised. That had become normal years ago. Still, a small part of me always hoped for something different. Around 6 o'clock, the first guests began arriving. Luxury cars filled our driveway. Men in expensive suits stepped through the front door. Women wearing designer dresses smiled politely as they introduced themselves. Richard instantly transformed. His posture changed. His voice became warmer. His smile appeared. I often wondered where that version of my husband disappeared to whenever we were alone. The house quickly filled with conversation and laughter. I moved between groups, carrying trays and refilling drinks. Most people were polite. Some were genuinely friendly. Others barely noticed me. Again, I was used to that. Corporate gatherings often made wives invisible. At one point, I found myself speaking with a woman I hadn't met before. She appeared to be in her late 50s, elegant, confident, observant, the kind of person who didn't need to raise her voice to command attention. Her name was Catherine Brooks. At the time, I had no idea who she was. We were standing near the dining room when she smiled warmly. "So, Deborah, what do you do?" It was such a simple question. Yet somehow, nobody had asked me that at one of Richard's events in years. For a moment, I felt almost embarrassed. Then I remembered how hard I had worked. I straightened my shoulders. I own a small handmade candle and home fragrance company. Her eyes lit up. Really? I nodded. Yes, I make candles and soaps and gift sets. Mostly online sales right now. That sounds wonderful. I smiled. For the first time all evening, I felt seen, not as Richard's wife, as myself. I was about to tell her more when Richard suddenly appeared beside us. He had a drink in one hand and a broad grin on his face. What are we talking about? Catherine turned toward him. Whoa! Your wife was telling me about her business. Richard laughed immediately. Not a small chuckle. Not a polite laugh. A loud, booming laugh that drew attention from nearby guests. Oh, that... My stomach tightened. I knew that tone. Several people glanced toward us. Richard took a sip of his drink. Then he said the words I will never forget. My wife has a cute little business. A few people smiled awkwardly. I felt heat rising into my face. Richard continued. You know, housewife money? Several guests laughed. Not because it was funny, because Richard was the boss. And when powerful people laugh, others often follow. I stood frozen. The laughter spread through the group. One man even nodded and said, Keeps her busy. Right. More laughter. I wanted to disappear. 35 years. 35 years of supporting this man. 35 years of sacrifice. And this was how he described something I had built from nothing. A cute little business. Housewife money. I forced a smile because crying would have given them what they expected. Weakness. Embarrassment. Proof that I couldn't handle a joke. Inside, however, something cracked. Not my confidence. Not my business. Something else. Something much deeper. The illusion that Richard respected me. Because in that moment, I realized he didn't. Maybe he never had. Catherine didn't laugh. I noticed that immediately. While everyone else smiled and moved on, she remained completely still. Watching, listening, studying the situation. Her expression never changed. And somehow, that made me feel less alone. The conversation shifted toward corporate topics. Revenue projections, investments, market trends, subjects Richard loved discussing. I quietly excused myself and headed toward the kitchen. The moment I was alone, I placed both hands on the counter. My chest hurt. I stared at the sink and took several slow breaths. I wasn't crying. Not yet. But I was close. A few minutes later, Sarah Mitchell arrived. She was one of the few friends I had invited. The moment she saw my face, she knew something was wrong. What happened? I tried to smile. Nothing. Deborah. I looked away. Sarah lowered her voice. What did Richard do? The fact that she immediately guessed the answer told me everything. I briefly explained what happened. Her expression darkened. He said that in front of everyone. I nodded. Sarah shook her head. That's not teasing. I know. That's humiliation. I didn't answer, because she was right, and hearing it out loud somehow made it worse. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. I smiled when required, served dinner, cleared plates, refilled drinks, played the role everyone expected. Meanwhile, Richard continued entertaining guests as though nothing had happened. as though he hadn't publicly reduced years of my work to a punchline. Around 10 o'clock, the party finally began winding down. Guests collected coats and exchanged goodbyes. I stood near the front door, thanking people for coming. One by one, they left. Eventually, Catherine approached. She was holding her purse and car keys. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she reached into her handbag. She removed a business card and handed it to me. I looked down. The card was simple. Professional, elegant, Catherine Brooks. There was a title beneath her name. But before I could read it, she spoke. "When you're ready, give me a call." I blinked. "What do you mean?" A faint smile appeared. "I think you know exactly what I mean." I felt confused. "Did I miss something?" Her expression softened. "No." She glanced toward the living room where Richard was laughing with another executive. Then she looked back at me. "I've spent 30 years investing in businesses." I stared at her. Investing. Suddenly, the card in my hand felt heavier. Catherine continued. "And I've learned something very important." I waited. She lowered her voice. "The people everyone overlooks are often the ones worth watching." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she smiled. A genuine smile. The kind that reaches someone's eyes. "Call me, Deborah." With that, she walked out the door. I stood there frozen, watching her disappear into the night. A strange feeling settled over me. For the first time since the humiliation earlier that evening, I felt something unexpected. Hope. I looked down at the card again. I still didn't fully understand who Catherine Brooks was. But something told me that meeting her was not an accident. And as I would soon discover, that single business card was about to change the course of my life. Meanwhile, upstairs in his home office, Richard was celebrating what he believed had been another successful evening. He had no idea that while he was busy laughing at my little business, someone far more powerful than either of us had just taken an interest in it. I stared at Catherine Brooks's business card for nearly an hour after the party ended. The house was finally quiet. The dishes were done. The guests were gone. Richard had gone upstairs to his office, where he often spent late evenings reviewing reports and answering emails. As for me, I sat alone at the kitchen table. The card rested beside a cold cup of tea. I picked it up again. Then again. Then one more time. Part of me wanted to call immediately. Another part was terrified. People like Catherine Brooks didn't enter the lives of women like me. At least that was what I had always believed. Successful investors spoke to CEOs, founders, executives, not 62-year-old women making candles in a garage. Oh, eventually, I tucked the card into my purse and went to bed. But I couldn't sleep. Richard's laughter kept replaying in my mind. "My wife has a cute little business." The words echoed over and over. At 2 a.m, I finally sat up in bed. I looked toward Richard. He was asleep beside me, peaceful, unaffected, as if nothing had happened. As if he hadn't humiliated me in front of an entire room. Something shifted inside me that night. Not anger, not revenge, something stronger, clarity. For years, I had spent my energy trying to earn Richard's approval. Maybe it was time to stop. Maybe it was time to focus on earning my own. The next morning, after Richard left for work, I called Catherine. I expected voicemail. Instead, she answered immediately. "Deborah," I blinked. "You knew it was me," she laughed softly. "I was hoping you'd call." Her confidence made me smile. For the next 30 minutes, we talked. Not about Richard. Not about the dinner party. About business. For the first time, someone asked serious questions about my company. Revenue, customers, production, margins, growth. When the conversation ended, Catherine surprised me. "I'd like to see your operation." I almost laughed. "Operation? Your business." "It's just my garage." "Then show me your garage." 3 days later, Catherine arrived. I spent the entire morning cleaning. Not because she expected perfection, because I was nervous. When she walked into the garage, she immediately began examining everything. The shelves, the inventory, the packaging, the product labels. She asked dozens of questions. I answered every one. After nearly an hour, she crossed her arms and looked around. "Do you know what your biggest problem is?" I swallowed. "What?" "You still think you're running a hobby." The statement caught me off guard. "I don't understand." "Deborah, your products are good." I blinked. "Really? They're better than good." She picked up one of my candles. "But your branding doesn't match the quality." That afternoon became my first real lesson. Catherine explained things nobody had ever taught me. Packaging psychology, customer perception, brand positioning, online marketing, product photography, target demographics. I filled pages of notes. Before leaving, she looked at me seriously. "If you're willing to work, this can become something much bigger." My heart started racing. "How much bigger?" She smiled. "Let's find out." That conversation changed everything. Over the next several months, I stopped treating my business like a side project. I treated it like a company. Every morning, I woke up with a purpose. Instead of watching television during the afternoon, I studied marketing courses. I learned about e-commerce, social media, search engine optimization, email campaigns. Yeah, some of it felt overwhelming. Most of it felt exciting. For the first time in years, my brain felt alive. Sarah noticed immediately. One afternoon, she visited while I was redesigning product labels. "You look different." I laughed. "Different how?" "Happier." I stared at the computer screen. Maybe she was right. For years, I had focused on everyone else's needs. Now I was finally investing in myself. The results started appearing faster than I expected. My website traffic increased. Online orders doubled, then tripled. Customers began posting reviews. Many became repeat buyers. One woman ordered gifts for her entire office. Another ordered products for her daughter's wedding. Each order felt like proof. Proof that my work mattered. Proof that I mattered. Richard barely noticed, or at least he pretended not to. Whenever he saw me working late, he would shake his head. Still playing entrepreneur, I stopped arguing. That confused him more than any debate ever had. Because I no longer needed him to believe in me. I was starting to believe in myself. One evening, Richard walked into the garage while I was packing shipments. His eyes moved across the shelves. There were significantly more products than before. More inventory. More boxes. More supplies. He frowned. "You've spent a lot of money." "It's an investment," he laughed. "That's exactly what people say before they lose money." I continued packing. No reaction, no defense, no explanation. Richard seemed almost disappointed. He lingered another moment before leaving. As soon as he disappeared, I smiled, because for the first time, his opinion had not ruined my day. A few weeks later, Catherine called. "Are you sitting down immediately?" My stomach tightened. "What happened?" "I showed your products to someone." I froze. "Who? Ethan Parker?" The name meant nothing to me. She continued. "Oh, he handles purchasing for a regional boutique chain." My heart started pounding. I sat down. "What did he say?" "He wants samples." For several seconds, I couldn't speak. Samples. Not orders. Not contracts. Just samples. Yet somehow, it felt enormous, because it meant someone important had noticed. For the next week, I worked harder than ever. Every candle had to be perfect. Every label straight. Every package flawless. I shipped the samples and waited. Then I waited some more. Every morning, I checked my email. Nothing. Every afternoon, I refreshed my inbox. Nothing. 2 weeks passed. Then 3. I started convincing myself that the opportunity was gone. Maybe the products weren't good enough. Maybe I wasn't good enough. Maybe Richard had been right all along. Then the email arrived. I was standing in the kitchen when my phone vibrated. My hands trembled as I opened it. The message was from Ethan Parker. He thanked me for the samples. He praised the quality, the presentation, the fragrances, the customer experience. Then I reached the final paragraph. I read it twice, then 3 times, then 4, because I couldn't believe what I was seeing. His company wanted to place a trial order. A real order. The largest order my business had ever received. I sat down at the kitchen table. Tears filled my eyes. Not because of the money. Because somebody believed in what I had built. For a long time, I simply stared out the window, thinking, reflecting, remembering every joke, every dismissal, every moment I had questioned myself. Suddenly, all of it felt smaller. That evening, I almost told Richard. Almost. But something stopped me. Not fear. Instinct. A feeling that this achievement belonged to me before it belonged to anyone else. So I kept the news to myself. At least for one night. As the sun disappeared beyond the trees outside our home, I sat alone in the garage, surrounded by candles, shipping boxes, and dreams that were finally beginning to take shape. For the first time, I could see a future bigger than survival, a future built on possibility. What I didn't know was that while my business was preparing for its biggest opportunity yet, Richard's company was quietly moving toward its first major disaster. And very soon, the cracks in his empire would become impossible to ignore. The first sign that something was wrong with Richard's company came on a Monday morning. At the time, it seemed insignificant. A small crack, easy to ignore. But sometimes disasters announce themselves quietly before they arrive. Richard was sitting at the breakfast table staring at his phone. Normally, mornings followed a predictable routine. Coffee, financial news, emails, then work. That day felt different. His jaw was tight. His coffee sat untouched. His eyes moved repeatedly across the same message. I noticed immediately. After 35 years of marriage, you learn to recognize changes in someone's mood, even when they try to hide them. "Everything okay?" I asked. Richard looked up quickly. Too quickly. "Fine." Then he returned to his phone. Conversation over. I didn't push. I had learned long ago that Richard hated discussing problems, especially when he didn't have solutions. A few minutes later, he grabbed his briefcase and headed toward the door. As he left, his phone rang. He answered immediately, his voice lowered. The expression on his face changed. Serious, concerned, almost worried. I watched from the kitchen window as he stood beside his car talking for nearly 10 minutes. When he finally drove away, a strange feeling settled in my stomach. Something wasn't right. I couldn't explain why. I simply knew. Over the next several weeks, the changes became more noticeable. Richard started coming home later. Much later, sometimes after 9, sometimes after 10, occasionally after midnight. Whenever I asked where he'd been, the answer was always the same. Work, nothing more. No details, no explanations. Just work. At first, I believed him. Then I started paying attention. His behavior became increasingly erratic. He snapped at small things, forgot conversations, lost his temper more easily. One evening, I accidentally broke a wine glass while unloading the dishwasher. The crash brought Richard into the kitchen. His reaction shocked me. "Can you be careful for once?" I stared at him. "What? You heard me." His voice was sharp, harsh, disproportionate. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he turned around and walked away. No apology, no acknowledgement, nothing. I stood there holding a towel and staring at shattered glass. Confused. The man I married had always been ambitious. Sometimes arrogant, occasionally insensitive, but this felt different. This felt like pressure, as if something was pushing down on him from all sides. And whatever it was, he was losing the ability to hide it. Meanwhile, my own business continued growing. The trial order from Ethan Parker's company had gone better than I ever imagined. Customers loved the products. Several locations sold out faster than expected. New orders began arriving regularly. For the first time, I was generating consistent income. Not life-changing money, but real money, meaningful money. Money I had earned myself. I wanted to feel proud. Instead, I found myself hiding my excitement. Because every success seemed to irritate Richard. One evening, I shared a small victory anyway. Ethan called today. Richard barely looked up from his laptop. Who? The purchasing director. Oh. They're considering expanding the order. His fingers stopped typing. For a brief moment, then resumed. That's nice. The words sounded hollow, forced. I recognized fake support when I heard it. That's all, Richard sighed. What do you want me to say? I blinked. I don't know. He closed the laptop. Deborah, it's candles. There it was again. That tone, that dismissal. As if everything I accomplished existed on a lower level than everything he accomplished. I nodded slowly, then changed the subject. The truth was becoming harder to ignore. Richard didn't want me to succeed. Not really. He wanted me to stay small, safe, dependent. A few days later, Sarah Mitchell stopped by unexpectedly. We sat on the back patio drinking iced tea. As usual, she noticed things I missed. Richard seemed stressed. I laughed softly. That's one way to describe it. She became serious. No, Deborah, I mean really stressed. I frowned. What do you mean? Sarah leaned forward. My cousin works at his company. My stomach tightened. Immediately. What did she say? Nothing specific. That answer somehow worried me more. But, Sarah hesitated. People are nervous. I stared at her. Nervous how? Layoffs? Budget cuts? Delayed projects? The words landed heavily. Richard had mentioned none of it. Not once. Maybe it's just rumors, I said. Sarah didn't look convinced. Maybe, but neither of us believed it. That conversation stayed with me for days. The more I thought about it, the more pieces started fitting together. The late nights, the short temper, the secretive phone calls, the constant stress. Maybe Richard wasn't simply having a bad month. Maybe something bigger was happening. Then came the first undeniable sign. It happened during dinner. Richard's phone rang. He glanced at the screen. His face immediately hardened. Without saying a word, he stood and left the room. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but his voice carried from the hallway. No. Silence. Then louder. That's not acceptable. More silence. Then, we cannot lose that account. My fork stopped halfway to my mouth. Account? Lose? The words echoed in my head. Several minutes later, Richard returned. His face was pale. I had never seen him look that way before. Not once in 35 years. What happened? I asked carefully. Nothing. The answer came too fast, too sharp. I set my fork down. Richard. I said it's nothing. The conversation ended there, but the truth was becoming impossible to hide. A week later, I accidentally discovered just how serious things were. I had stopped by Richard's office building to bring him a folder he forgot at home. Normally, I would leave it at reception. That day, however, the receptionist recognized me. Mrs. Elliott, he's upstairs. I smiled politely and headed toward the executive floor. As I approached Richard's office, I heard voices. Raised voices. Angry voices. The conference room door wasn't fully closed. I wasn't trying to listen. But I couldn't help hearing. One man said, "We lost the contract because you ignored the warning signs." Another replied, "The board is asking questions." Then came Richard's voice. Defensive, frustrated. "They're overreacting." Silence followed. Then someone else spoke. $3 million isn't an overreaction. Oh. My heart skipped. $3 million, I stood frozen. Suddenly, the pieces began fitting together. The stress, the mood swings, the secrecy. The company was in trouble. Real trouble. Before anyone could see me. I quietly turned around and left. The entire drive home felt surreal. I kept replaying the conversation. $3 million. Lost contract. Board questions. For years, Richard had built an image of absolute control, absolute success, absolute confidence. Now, cracks were appearing. Serious cracks. That evening, I watched him carefully. Richard looked exhausted, older somehow, as if the weight he carried was finally becoming visible. Part of me felt sorry for him. Another part felt something else. Confusion. Because if his company was struggling, why wasn't he addressing it? Why wasn't he asking for help? Why was he pretending everything was normal? The answer arrived a few days later, and it changed everything. I learned that the contract his company had lost wasn't caused by bad luck, or market conditions, or economic challenges. It had been caused by Richard himself, his arrogance, his refusal to listen, his belief that he always knew better than everyone around him. The very traits he mocked in others had finally come back to haunt him. And although Richard didn't realize it yet, that lost contract was only the beginning. His empire was no longer cracking. It was collapsing. The email from Ethan Parker arrived on a Wednesday morning. I must have read it 20 times, maybe more. Every time I looked at the screen, the words still felt unreal. His company wanted to place a larger order, not a sample, not a trial, a real order, a serious order, the kind of order that could transform a small business. I sat alone in my garage office staring at the numbers. The amount was larger than all my sales from the previous 3 months combined. For several minutes, I simply cried. Not dramatic sobbing, just quiet tears, the kind that come when you've spent years believing your dreams are too small to matter. For so long. I had measured success by whether other people approved of me. Now, someone who had never met me was approving of my work. That felt different. That felt real. I immediately called Catherine. She answered on the second ring. "You got the email." I laughed through my tears. "How did you know?" "I know Ethan." My smile widened. "You knew this was coming." "I hoped it was." I leaned back in my chair. "Catherine, I don't know what to say." "Say thank you after you become successful." I laughed. Then her tone became serious. "Deborah, yes, this is only the beginning." The words stayed with me long after the call ended. Only the beginning. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine something bigger. Not a hobby, not a side business, a company, A real company. Over the next 2 weeks, my life became a whirlwind. Production increased dramatically. I ordered additional supplies, created new schedules, expanded inventory. The garage was no longer large enough for everything. Boxes lined the walls. Shelves overflowed. Shipping labels covered my desk. Every day felt exciting, exhausting, wonderful, and terrifying, because success brought new responsibilities, new risks, new expectations. Still, I loved every minute of it. One Friday afternoon, Ethan Parker called personally. His voice was warm and professional. "Deborah, I wanted to discuss the next phase." My heart immediately started racing. "The next phase? We've received strong feedback from customers." I smiled. "That's great." "It's more than great." I gripped the phone tighter. "What does that mean?" "We'd like to expand distribution." For a moment, I couldn't speak. Expand distribution. The words echoed in my head. Ethan continued. "We're considering placing your products in additional boutique locations throughout Ohio and neighboring states." I stared out the garage window. Ohio and neighboring states? Just months earlier, I had been selling candles to local neighbors. Now stores across multiple states wanted my products. The thought felt almost impossible. After the call ended, I sat quietly for several minutes. Then I did something I probably shouldn't have done. I decided to tell Richard. Part of me still wanted to share good news with my husband. Part of me still hoped. That evening, Richard arrived home around 7. He looked exhausted. His tie was loosened. Dark circles sat beneath his eyes. The stress was becoming impossible to hide. Still, I followed him into the kitchen. "I got some exciting news today." He opened the refrigerator. Ethan called. That got his attention. Slightly. He closed the refrigerator door. "What now?" "They want to expand distribution." Richard stared at me. I waited. Surely even he would recognize how significant this was. Instead, he shrugged. "Okay." I blinked. "Okay. What do you want me to say?" I felt disappointment spreading through my chest. "It's a major opportunity. It's candles, Deborah." There it was again. That phrase, that dismissal. I felt my excitement fading. This could become a regional brand. Richard laughed softly. Not cruelly, not loudly. Somehow, that made it worse. A regional candle brand. I stared at him. He continued. "Let's not get carried away." The room suddenly felt smaller. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I asked the question that had been bothering me for months. "Why does this upset you?" Richard frowned. "It doesn't." "Then why do you always talk about it like it doesn't matter?" His expression hardened. "I didn't say it doesn't matter." "You act like it doesn't." The silence stretched. Finally, Richard shook his head. "You're being overly sensitive?" I laughed bitterly. That answer felt familiar. Whenever my feelings became inconvenient, I was accused of being sensitive, too emotional, too dramatic, too something, never justified, never reasonable, always wrong. I walked away before the conversation could become an argument. Later that night, I lay awake thinking. The truth was becoming impossible to ignore. Richard wasn't happy for me. And he wasn't even pretending anymore. Meanwhile, strange things continued happening at his company. The following week, I attended a networking luncheon Catherine recommended. It was my first time participating in a professional business event as an entrepreneur. I felt nervous, out of place, almost fraudulent. Everyone seemed successful, experienced, confident. Then I remembered something Catherine often told me. You belong in every room your work earns you. So I stayed. And I learned. During one conversation, I mentioned Richard's company. The reaction surprised me. The woman I was speaking with hesitated. Only briefly, but I noticed. Everything okay? I asked. She forced a smile. Of course. Yet something felt off. Later, another person reacted similarly. Then another. Small pauses. Awkward expressions. Careful wording, as if people knew something they weren't saying. The pattern bothered me. When I mentioned it to Catherine afterward, she became unusually quiet. What? I asked. She sighed. How much has Richard told you? My stomach tightened immediately. About what? Catherine looked uncomfortable. That alone terrified me. I assumed you knew. Knew what? She hesitated, then shook her head. This isn't my conversation to have. I stared at her. Catherine, she placed a hand on my arm. Just be careful. Those 3 words stayed with me. Be careful. Not supportive, not reassuring, warning. The next few days were tense. Richard became increasingly distracted. Phone calls interrupted dinners. Emails arrived at all hours. He spent entire weekends locked inside his home office. The pressure around him seemed to be growing. One Sunday morning, I walked into the kitchen and found him staring at financial reports, stacks of them. His face looked pale. Older. Defeated. For a brief moment, I felt sympathy. Then he noticed me. Instantly. The papers disappeared. The mask returned. What? The hostility surprised me. Nothing. He gathered the reports. You don't need to worry about this. I nodded slowly. But inside, I already knew. Whatever was happening, it was serious. Very serious. The final clue arrived unexpectedly. A few days later, Catherine invited me to lunch. Halfway through the meal, she asked a strange question. Do you know who originally approached Richard's company 2 years ago? I shook my head. About what? The retail group Ethan works with? I frowned. What about them? Catherine leaned back in her chair. They approached Richard first. I stared at her. What? They wanted a partnership. I couldn't believe it. Really? She nodded. Richard rejected them. The information shocked me. Why would he do that? Catherine's expression became thoughtful. He believed they were too small. I sat in silence. Too small. The irony felt almost unbelievable. The very retail chain helping my business grow was the same opportunity Richard had dismissed years earlier. An opportunity that had since become enormously successful. Catherine continued. Many people inside his company disagreed with that decision. A chill ran through me. Suddenly, another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Poor decisions. Lost contracts. internal disagreements, board pressure. Everything seemed connected. And for the first time, I began wondering whether Richard's problems were much worse than anyone realized. Because while my company was finally beginning to rise, his company appeared to be sinking. And neither of us knew just how deep the water had become. The day I discovered our savings were gone started like any other day. There was no warning, no dramatic phone call, no obvious sign that my life was about to change. I was sitting at the kitchen table paying monthly bills. Something I had done for decades. Richard usually handled investments and major financial decisions. I managed household expenses. That arrangement had existed throughout most of our marriage. Back when trust came easily. Back when I believed we were partners. I was reviewing account balances when I noticed something strange. One of our savings accounts looked lower than usual. Much lower. At first, I assumed I was mistaken. Maybe I remembered the number incorrectly. Maybe a payment had cleared. Maybe there was a reasonable explanation. I logged into the account, then I checked the transaction history. My stomach immediately tightened. Several large transfers had been made over the previous 4 months. Not one, not two, several. Each transfer involved tens of thousands of dollars. I stared at the screen, certain I had misunderstood. I checked again, then again. The numbers didn't change. Nearly $200,000 had disappeared. My hands began shaking. For several seconds, I couldn't breathe. $200,000. Money we had spent decades saving. Money intended for retirement. Money intended for security. Money intended for our future. Gone. I immediately called the bank. The representative confirmed the transfers. All authorized, all legitimate, all initiated by Richard. When the call ended, I sat frozen. I wasn't angry yet. I was confused, terrified. Why hadn't he told me? What was happening? The question swirled through my mind all afternoon. By the time Richard arrived home, I had printed every transaction. The papers sat neatly arranged on the kitchen table, waiting. Just like I was. The moment he walked through the door, he knew something was wrong. His eyes immediately found the documents. His expression changed. Not surprise. Recognition. That frightened me more than anything. He already knew what I had discovered. I stood slowly. What happened to our savings? For several seconds, Richard said nothing. Then he loosened his tie, walked into the kitchen, and sat down. The casualness of the gesture shocked me, as if we were discussing the weather. Not our future, finally, he sighed. I was going to tell you. I laughed, a short, bitter laugh. When his jaw tightened, it became necessary. I stared at him. What does that mean? Richard rubbed his forehead. The company needed temporary support. The words sounded rehearsed, prepared, as if he had been expecting this conversation. I felt anger beginning to rise. You took $200,000. It wasn't taking. What would you call it? His voice hardened. Protecting our future. I blinked. By draining our savings. Richard leaned forward. You don't understand what's happening. Then explain it. For a moment, I thought he might. Instead, he looked away. That told me everything. Because people who have good explanations usually share them. People who don't avoid them. Richard, his eyes returned to mine. The company is experiencing challenges. Challenges. Corporate language. Meaningless language. The kind executives use when they don't want to say failure. How bad? Silence. Richard. Worse than I expected. The admission hit me like a punch. Not because of the words. Because Richard Elliott never admitted weakness. Never. Not in 35 years. Not once. I slowly sat down. How much trouble are you in? His face darkened. The question clearly irritated him. I'm handling it. That's not what I asked. The silence stretched. Finally, he spoke. We lost major accounts. I nodded. I already knew that much. What else? More silence. Then, we have debt. My stomach sank. How much debt? He didn't answer. That answer was worse than any number. The conversation continued for nearly an hour. Each answer revealed another problem. Lost contracts, declining revenue, pressure from lenders, concern from the board, growing liabilities. By the end, I barely recognized the company he had spent years bragging about. The empire he had built wasn't struggling. It was bleeding, and nobody seemed capable of stopping it, including Richard. The most painful part wasn't the financial loss. It was the secrecy. For months, he had watched me plan our future, retirement trips, home improvements, grandchildren's college funds, all while knowing the money was already gone. That betrayal cut deeper than any dollar amount. Eventually, I asked the question that had haunted me all evening. Why didn't you tell me? Richard's response came instantly. Because you'd panic. I stared at him, then slowly nodded. There it was. The truth. Not concern. Not protection. Disrespect. He didn't tell me because he didn't view me as an equal. He viewed me as someone who should simply trust him. Follow him. Obey him. The same pattern that had existed throughout our marriage. Only now, the consequences were much larger, much more dangerous. The next few weeks became increasingly tense. Richard spent nearly every waking hour focused on the company. Meanwhile, I became obsessed with understanding our finances. The more I reviewed documents, the more questions appeared. Some transactions didn't make sense. Some paperwork seemed incomplete. Some details felt intentionally vague. One evening, while organizing tax records, I found something unusual, a folder I didn't recognize. Inside were several business financing documents. At first glance, they appeared unrelated to me. Then I saw my company name, Elliott Home Sense. My pulse immediately accelerated. I pulled the documents closer, read every page, then read them again, certain I had misunderstood. I hadn't. The paperwork referenced my business, its assets, its revenue, its projected value. I turned pages faster, desperately searching for answers. Then I found the signature page. My blood ran cold. My name was there, Deborah Elliott, signed, dated, official. The problem was simple. I had never signed it, not ever. I stared at the page, unable to process what I was seeing. The signature looked remarkably similar to mine. Close enough to fool most people. Close enough to pass casual inspection. But not mine. Definitely not mine. I felt physically sick. For several minutes, I sat motionless. The implications were horrifying. Richard hadn't merely hidden financial problems. He had involved my business without permission, without discussion, without consent. When he came home that evening, I confronted him immediately. I placed the document on the dining room table. His face turned pale the moment he saw it. For the first time, genuine panic appeared in his eyes. "What is this?" He didn't answer. "Richard." Still nothing. My voice became louder. "What is this?" Finally, he spoke. It was necessary. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Necessary. The same word again. Always justification. Never accountability. You used my business. It was collateral. The room spun. Collateral. I repeated the word slowly, trying to understand, trying to remain calm. You used my company as collateral. It was temporary. I laughed. The sound shocked even me, because there was no humor in it, only disbelief. You never asked me. His expression hardened. "We're married." I stared at him. For several seconds, then longer. The sentence revealed everything. Everything. To Richard, marriage meant ownership, access, control. He genuinely believed my success belonged to him. My business belonged to him. My work belonged to him. My future belonged to him. And because of that belief, he had crossed a line. A dangerous line. A line I wasn't sure our marriage could survive. That night, I sat alone in the garage long after Richard went to bed. The shelves around me were filled with products I had created. Products built through years of effort, years of sacrifice, years of believing in myself when nobody else would, including my husband. For the first time, I wasn't thinking about growth or profits or expansion. I was thinking about protection because something inside me finally understood the truth. Richard wasn't simply struggling. He was desperate. And desperate people make dangerous decisions. As I stared at the forged-looking signature on the document, one terrifying question refused to leave my mind. If Richard was willing to use my business without permission, what else had he done that I didn't know about? I barely slept after discovering the document. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my signature staring back at me. Or rather, a version of my signature. A version I had never written. For years, I had trusted Richard with things most married couples never questioned. Finances, investments, retirement planning, major decisions. I had believed trust was one of the foundations of marriage. Now I wasn't sure what foundation we had left. At 3 o'clock in the morning, I got out of bed and walked downstairs. The house was silent. Dark. Cold. I sat at the kitchen table and spread the documents across the surface once again. The numbers looked even worse under the soft glow of the overhead light. Collateral agreements. Financing documents. Business valuations. Legal language I didn't fully understand. One thing, however, was crystal clear. My company was connected to Richard's financial problems, and I had never agreed to it. The realization made my stomach twist. Because if his company failed, what would happen to mine? That question followed me throughout the next day. By afternoon, I knew I needed professional advice. Not from Richard, not from friends, from someone who understood the law. Someone who could tell me exactly how much danger I was in. That was how I found myself sitting across from Melissa Carter 2 days later. Sarah had recommended her. "She's smart," Sarah had said, "and she doesn't scare easily." At that point, both qualities sounded valuable. Melissa's office was located in downtown Columbus. She was in her mid-40s, sharp-eyed, composed, and immediately direct. Within 5 minutes, I liked her. Within 10 minutes, I trusted her. I handed her the documents. She began reading, slowly, carefully, occasionally making notes. The longer she reviewed them, the more serious her expression became. That terrified me. After nearly 30 minutes, she finally looked up. "Tell me everything." So I did. The savings account, Richard's company, the missing money, the collateral agreements, the years of financial control. Everything. Melissa listened without interrupting. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair. "Deborah, I'm going to ask a question." "Okay. Did you sign any of these documents?" "No. None of them." "No." She nodded slowly, as if confirming something she already suspected. I felt my pulse accelerating. "What?" Melissa folded her hands together. "The first thing we need to do is protect your business. Not investigate, not discuss. Protect." The word immediately raised alarms. Protect it from what? She held my gaze. Potential liability. My mouth went dry. "How serious is this?" Her answer came without hesitation. "Potentially very serious." The room suddenly felt smaller. I gripped the arms of my chair. Melissa continued. "Your husband appears to have represented your company as an asset connected to financing agreements." I swallowed. "What does that mean?" "It means lenders may believe your business is tied to obligations that belong to his company." The sentence hit me like a punch. My business. The company I had built from scratch. The company that was finally beginning to succeed could be dragged down because of Richard's decisions. For several moments, I couldn't speak. Melissa waited patiently. Finally, I found my voice. "What do I do?" For the first time since entering her office, she smiled. "We create distance." That became the focus of the next several weeks. Distance. Legal distance. Financial distance. Documentation. Protection. Melissa worked methodically. Every conversation felt like a lesson. Every meeting revealed another risk I hadn't considered. First, we reviewed ownership records, then bank accounts, tax filings, business registrations, contracts, vendor agreements, anything that could establish the independence of Elliott HomeSense. The process was exhausting, but also empowering. For the first time, I understood every aspect of my company, every account, every asset, every obligation. The business no longer felt like a hobby. It felt real. Because it was real. Melissa encouraged me to open new business accounts completely separate from our household finances. I did. She advised me to move future revenue there. I did. She recommended documenting every business transaction moving forward. I did. The more control I gained, the stronger I felt. For years, I had depended on Richard to manage financial matters. Now I was learning to manage my own. The confidence that came with that realization surprised me. One afternoon, after a particularly productive meeting, I sat in my car outside Melissa's office and smiled. Not because my situation was improving, because I finally felt capable. Then came the moment everything changed. It happened during our fourth meeting. Melissa had requested additional copies of the financing documents. I delivered them that morning. She spent nearly an hour reviewing signatures, comparing pages, studying details. Eventually, she became unusually quiet. That immediately caught my attention. "What is it?" Melissa didn't answer right away. She continued examining one page, then another, then another. Finally, she looked up. "Deborah." The seriousness in her voice made my heart sink. "Yes." "Can I see your driver's license?" I blinked. "What?" "Your driver's license." Confused, I handed it to her. She placed it beside one of the financing documents. Then she compared the signatures several times. Silence filled the office. I watched her expression change, slowly, deliberately, until my stomach twisted into knots. "What is it?" Melissa set both documents down, then took a deep breath. "Are you absolutely certain you didn't sign this?" I stared at her. Absolutely. No hesitation, no uncertainty. I knew my own signature. Melissa nodded, then said the words that changed everything. "I don't believe you did either." The room went silent. For a moment, I wasn't sure I understood. Then the meaning hit me, hard. "You think he forged it?" Melissa chose her words carefully. "I believe there are significant inconsistencies." I felt dizzy. Actually dizzy. I reached for the edge of the desk. My entire body felt numb. Because until that moment, part of me had still been searching for an explanation. A misunderstanding. A mistake. Anything. Now that hope vanished. The possibility sitting in front of me was far worse. This wasn't carelessness. This wasn't poor communication. This wasn't a husband making bad financial decisions. This was something else. Something darker. Something deliberate. I stared at the document, at the signature, at the evidence, and suddenly 35 years of marriage felt unfamiliar. Who was the man I had trusted all those years? The drive home felt endless. Questions filled my head. Memories. Conversations. Excuses. Lies. How many times had Richard hidden things from me? How many decisions had he made without my knowledge? How many boundaries had he crossed because he assumed he had the right? By the time I reached home, I felt emotionally exhausted. The garage became my refuge once again. I sat among shelves filled with candles and shipping supplies. The familiar scent of lavender surrounded me. Normally, it brought comfort. Today, it didn't. Today, I felt something new. Fear, not fear of failure. Fear of what I might still discover. Because if Melissa was right, if Richard had truly forged my signature, then the situation was far worse than hidden debt, far worse than financial trouble. It meant the man I had spent 35 years trusting had crossed a legal line, a serious one. And deep down, I had a feeling this was only the beginning. Because desperate people rarely commit just one desperate act. And Richard Elliott was becoming more desperate every day. The collapse of Richard's company stopped being a private problem on a rainy Tuesday morning. Until then, most of the damage had happened behind closed doors. Board meetings, legal consultations, emergency phone calls, financial reports. People inside the company knew things were bad. People outside the company only suspected. That changed when the first newspaper article appeared. I was drinking coffee in the kitchen when Sarah called. Her voice sounded urgent. "Deborah." Immediately, I knew something was wrong. "What happened? Have you seen the news?" My stomach tightened. "No." "Turn on your computer." The moment the call ended, I opened my laptop. A local business publication appeared on the screen. The headline was impossible to miss. Columbus Packaging Group faces growing financial pressure. I stared at the article, then began reading. The story mentioned delayed vendor payments, contract losses, debt concerns, leadership criticism, anonymous sources describing internal instability. Nothing was officially catastrophic. But anyone who understood business could see where things were heading. The article was a warning shot, a public one. For several minutes, I sat motionless, not because I was surprised, because seeing it in print made everything real. The problems were no longer rumors, no longer private conversations, no longer hidden. The entire city now knew something was wrong. When Richard came downstairs that morning, he looked exhausted. I had never seen him age so quickly. Dark circles surrounded his eyes. His shoulders seemed permanently tense. I watched him pour coffee. Then I asked quietly, "Did you see the article?" His hand froze, just for a second. Then he continued pouring. "Yes, nothing more. No explanation. No denial. Just yes." I waited. Richard stared into his coffee cup. The media doesn't understand the situation. The statement sounded rehearsed, defensive. I had heard versions of it before, from politicians, executives, public figures, people whose problems had become impossible to hide. "What part don't they understand?" I asked. His jaw tightened. "Everything." I nodded slowly, then returned to my coffee. The conversation ended there. But the tension followed us throughout the day. Over the next several weeks, more articles appeared. Each one revealed a little more. Delayed payments, vendor disputes, contract cancellations, management concerns, employee departures. The picture becoming clearer with every headline. Richard hated every article. I could tell. Each new story made him angrier, more defensive, more unpredictable. Meanwhile, my own business continued growing. Ethan's expanded distribution program had launched successfully. New boutique locations began carrying my products. Orders increased again. For the first time, I hired part-time help, a retired woman named Carol who lived nearby. The decision felt surreal. Someone was working for me. Me, the woman whose husband still called her business a hobby. One afternoon, while Carol helped prepare shipments, my phone rang. It was Catherine. How are you holding up? I knew exactly what she meant. The business is doing great. And Richard, I looked toward the window, thinking, choosing my words carefully. I don't recognize him anymore. Silence followed. Then Catherine sighed. Success hides people's flaws. What does that mean? It means some people look strong until they're tested. Her words stayed with me long after the conversation ended. Because Richard was being tested, and he was failing. Not financially, personally. The financial problems were only exposing who he already was. The real crisis wasn't the debt. It was his inability to take responsibility. Every setback became someone else's fault. The economy, the market, employees, competitors, vendors, anyone except himself. One evening, that reality became impossible to ignore. Richard arrived home furious, not stressed, not frustrated, furious. The front door slammed hard enough to shake the walls. I looked up from the kitchen table. Immediately, I knew something had happened. He threw his briefcase onto a chair, then loosened his tie aggressively. Unbelievable. I stayed calm. What happened? Richard laughed bitterly. The vultures. I frowned. What? The reporters. He paced across the kitchen. Everyone suddenly thinks they're an expert. His anger seemed enormous, disproportionate when reviewed, as though the article itself wasn't the real issue, as though something worse had happened. Then he turned toward me, and everything changed. You know what's funny? The question caught me off guard. What? You never supported me. I stared at him, certain I had heard wrong. What? His eyes narrowed. You heard me. For a moment, I couldn't speak. After everything, after decades of sacrifice, after raising children, supporting his career, building our home, standing beside him through every challenge. This was his conclusion. I never supported him. The accusation felt absurd, cruel, completely disconnected from reality. What are you talking about? Richard shook his head. You've been focused on your business. I blinked. My business. Yes. The anger in his voice grew. While I'm dealing with real problems, the statement hung in the air. Heavy. Ugly. revealing real problems. There it was again. The same belief, the same arrogance. My work mattered less. My struggles mattered less. My accomplishments mattered less. Everything I built existed beneath him. For the first time, I didn't stay quiet. I stood slowly, carefully, and looked directly at him. "My business is real," Richard laughed. The sound immediately transported me back to that dinner party. That humiliation, that public mockery, something inside me hardened. "My business is paying its bills." His smile vanished. "My business is growing." Silence. "My business isn't using someone else's savings to survive." The words landed like a slap. Richard's face turned red. Instantly. I knew I had struck a nerve. Neither of us spoke. Then Richard grabbed his briefcase and left the room. The conversation ended, but the damage remained. A few days later, another unexpected development occurred. I received a phone call from one of my suppliers. Linda Foster. We had worked together for nearly a year. She supplied several fragrance ingredients I used regularly. Normally, our conversations focused on inventory, shipping schedules, new products. This call felt different. "Deborah, do you have a minute?" Her tone immediately concerned me. "Of course." Linda hesitated, then lowered her voice. "I need to ask you something." My stomach tightened. "What is it? Are you still married to Richard Elliott?" The question surprised me. "Yes." Silence. Then, "I was afraid of that." A chill ran through me. "What happened?" Linda sighed heavily. "My company is one of the vendors he owes money to." I closed my eyes. Of course. Another unpaid vendor. Another damaged relationship. Another consequence. "I'm sorry," I said quietly. "That's not why I'm calling." The seriousness in her voice made me sit up straighter. "What do you mean?" Another pause. Then Linda spoke carefully. "There are things happening that don't make sense?" My pulse accelerated. "What things?" "I can't discuss everything over the phone." Fear settled into my chest. The genuine kind. Not anxiety. Not worry. Fear. Because Linda sounded like someone carrying information she wasn't sure how to share. "Linda." "Yes." "What are you trying to tell me?" Her answer came softly, almost reluctantly. "I think you need to see some documents." The room suddenly felt colder. Documents. The word immediately reminded me of Melissa. The signatures, the financing agreements, the secrets. I gripped the phone tighter. "What kind of documents?" Linda hesitated one final time, then spoke the sentence that would change everything. "The kind that might explain why Richard is acting so desperate." After the call ended, I sat alone in the garage, staring at nothing, thinking about everything: the newspaper articles, the debt, the accusations, the forged signature. Now, documents from an unpaid vendor. The pieces were beginning to form a larger picture, a much darker picture. And for the first time, I started wondering whether Richard's financial collapse was only part of the story. Because desperation leaves clues. And those clues were leading somewhere. Somewhere I wasn't sure I wanted to go. I met Linda Foster 3 days after her phone call. The entire drive to her office, I kept asking myself the same question. How much worse could this possibly get by that point? I already knew Richard had drained our savings. I knew he had used my business as collateral. I knew Melissa suspected my signature had been forged. I knew his company was falling apart publicly. Surely there couldn't be much more. I was wrong. Linda owned a specialty fragrance supply company on the north side of Columbus. When I arrived, she greeted me warmly, but I immediately noticed the tension in her face. She looked nervous, almost reluctant, as though she didn't want to be having this conversation. We sat in a small conference room. A folder rested on the table between us. My eyes immediately locked onto it. Documents. Just like she had mentioned, Linda folded her hands. Before I show you these, I need you to understand something. I nodded. Okay. I'm not trying to hurt you. The statement made my stomach tighten. I know. She sighed heavily. I considered staying out of it, but... Her expression darkened. But you deserve the truth. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she opened the folder. Inside were invoices, emails, financial records, vendor correspondence. Most of it looked routine, until she pointed toward several highlighted sections. This is where things stopped making sense. I leaned forward, carefully reading. The more I read, the more confused I became. Several suppliers had been promised payments, then delayed again. The explanations changed repeatedly. Cash flow issues, temporary restructuring, administrative problems. Every excuse sounded different, yet the outcome remained the same. Nobody got paid. I looked up. Why are you showing me this? Linda hesitated, then slid another document across the table. This. The moment I saw Richard's signature, my chest tightened. I continued reading. Halfway down the page, my heart nearly stopped. My company's name appeared again. Elliott Home Sense. I stared at the document. Unable to speak, Linda nodded slowly. Exactly. My voice barely worked. What is this? A financing proposal. I looked closer. The proposal referenced projected revenue from my business, future growth estimates, potential asset value, information Richard should never have possessed, information I had never authorized him to use. My pulse accelerated. He submitted this, Linda nodded. Several months ago, I felt sick. Not because of the numbers, because of what it revealed. Richard wasn't acting impulsively. This wasn't one desperate decision. This was a pattern, a deliberate pattern. Months of using my company behind my back. Months of making decisions without my knowledge. Months of risking something I had built. I sat back in my chair, trying to process everything. Linda spoke quietly. There's more. My stomach dropped. Of course there was. There always seemed to be more. She handed me several printed emails. Most involved lenders, consultants, financial advisors. I scanned the pages quickly, then stopped. One sentence caught my attention immediately. If additional collateral becomes available through spouse-owned assets. I read it again. Then a third time. My hands began shaking. Richard hadn't viewed my company as separate from his problems. He viewed it as a solution to them. An asset. A resource. Something available for sacrifice. Something available to save him. I suddenly understood why he had reacted so negatively to my success. Why he mocked it. Why he dismissed it. Why he refused to celebrate it. Because he didn't see it as mine. He saw it as his, a backup plan, a financial lifeboat. The realization hurt more than I expected. After 35 years of marriage, I wanted to believe there had been some respect beneath the arrogance, some appreciation beneath the control. Now I wasn't sure. When the meeting ended, Linda touched my arm gently. "I'm sorry," I nodded, and for once, I had no words. The drive home felt endless. My thoughts raced. Every new discovery painted the same picture. Richard was desperate. Far more desperate than he admitted. Far more desperate than anyone realized. That evening, I called Melissa. By the next morning, I was sitting in her office again. The new documents were spread across her desk. She reviewed them carefully, methodically, occasionally making notes. Eventually, she leaned back. Her expression was grim. Deborah, I already knew I wasn't going to like what came next. Yes, you were right to come here." My heart sank. "How bad is it?" Melissa folded her hands. "The good news is that we've already begun separating your business." I nodded. "But the bad news is that Richard appears to have represented your company repeatedly." I closed my eyes. For a moment, exhaustion washed over me. I was so tired. Tired of surprises. Tired of secrets. Tired of discovering new ways my trust had been violated. Melissa continued. "We need to move quickly." That became our focus. Again, moving quickly, protecting the business, protecting assets, protecting evidence, protecting me. Over the following weeks, my life divided into two completely different worlds. One world was thriving, the other was collapsing. My business continued growing. Ethan called regularly with positive updates. Additional boutiques wanted products. Customer demand remained strong. Sales increased. Reviews poured in. For the first time in my life, people sought my advice as a business owner. That still felt strange. Wonderful, but strange. Then Catherine called and changed everything again. "Are you sitting down?" The question immediately made me nervous. What happened? "I have an opportunity," I laughed softly. "That sounds dangerous." "It might be." I sat down. "Tell me." Her voice became serious. "A national distribution opportunity." The room went silent. National, not regional, not statewide. National. I couldn't speak. For several seconds, I simply stared at the wall, certain I had misheard. "Catherine." "I know." My voice trembled. "You're serious?" "Very. The opportunity was enormous. Life-changing. The kind of opportunity small business owners dream about for decades. The kind most never receive." As Catherine explained the details, excitement and fear battled inside me. Because the opportunity came with conditions, requirements, reviews, legal verification, business audits, and one critical issue. The company needed absolute proof that Elliott Home Sense was legally independent. My stomach immediately tightened. Because I already knew the problem: Richard, the collateral documents, the questionable signatures, the financial entanglements. Everything. Catherine seemed to read my mind. Deborah, yes, we can work through this. I nodded slowly. But it has to be clean. There was that word again. Clean, independent, protected. Everything suddenly depended on proving those things. After the call ended, I sat alone in the garage, looking around at everything I had built. Shelves of products, boxes ready for shipment. Years of effort, years of growth, years of believing in something nobody else respected. Now that dream stood on the edge of becoming something extraordinary. Yet Richard's choices still threatened it. The thought terrified me. Later that evening, another surprise arrived. Catherine called again. This time, her tone was different, more cautious, more deliberate. "What is it?" I asked. She hesitated, then spoke carefully. "There's something I haven't told you." Immediately, my pulse quickened. "What?" "I have known about Richard's situation longer than you think." I froze. "What do you mean?" Silence. Then, "Several investors have been watching his company for months." A chill moved through me. "Months?" "Yes." My grip tightened around the phone. "How bad is it?" Catherine's answer came quietly, almost gently. "Worse than what's been reported." The room suddenly felt colder. Because if Catherine was right, then Richard's collapse wasn't approaching. It had already begun. And very soon, the rest of the world was going to find out. The first time Richard called Elliott Home Sense our business, I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was unbelievable. After years of dismissing my work as a hobby, a cute little project, and housewife money, he had suddenly changed his vocabulary. The shift happened almost overnight, and it told me exactly how desperate he had become. It started on a Friday afternoon. I was reviewing inventory reports in the garage when Richard appeared in the doorway. His presence immediately felt unusual. For months, he had barely shown interest in my business. Now he was standing there studying the shelves, the products, the shipping station, the branded packaging, everything. "You've grown this place." I looked up, carefully. "Yes," he nodded. "It's impressive." The compliment felt strange, unnatural, like hearing a foreign language from someone who had never spoken it before. I waited, because I knew there was more coming. There always was. Richard walked deeper into the garage. "You know, Deborah, there it was. The tone, the setup, the calculated approach. I've been thinking." I closed my laptop with dangerous words. "What about?" He smiled. Not warmly, strategically. "About the future?" Immediately, my guard went up. For years, discussions about the future had meant his future, his goals, His priorities. Never mine. Richard leaned against a workbench. I think we've spent too much time operating separately. I stared at him, trying to understand where this conversation was going. What do you mean? I mean your business. The phrase caught my attention immediately. Your business. Not our business. Not yet, Richard continued. It's doing very well, I nodded slowly. Yes. And I think there may be opportunities. There it was. The word, opportunities. Whenever Richard wanted something, opportunities suddenly appeared. What kind of opportunities? His smile widened. Partnership opportunities. For several seconds, I simply stared at him. Then I laughed. A genuine laugh. Because the idea was absurd. Richard didn't laugh. His expression hardened. What's funny? I stood up. You. The word escaped before I could stop it. His eyes narrowed. What does that mean? I crossed my arms. It means you've spent years telling me this business wasn't real. Silence. It means you've spent years mocking it. More silence. It means you laughed at it in front of your colleagues. His jaw tightened. I continued. And now suddenly you see opportunities for the first time. Richard looked uncomfortable. Actually uncomfortable. Not angry, not arrogant. Uncomfortable. Because everything I said was true. The facts were impossible to deny. After a long pause, he sighed. People change. I almost laughed again. No, people reveal themselves. That felt more accurate. The conversation ended shortly afterward. But it didn't end the problem. Because Richard wasn't finished. Not even close. Over the next several weeks, his behavior became increasingly strange. He began asking questions. Lots of questions. About revenue, profit margins, expansion plans, distribution agreements, future projections. The same topics he had ignored for years. Now he wanted details. Specific details. It didn't take long to understand why. His company was getting worse. Much worse. The newspaper articles continued. Industry rumors intensified. More vendors complained publicly. Additional contracts disappeared. And through it all, Richard's attention shifted toward my growing success. One evening, Catherine called with exciting news. A national retail buyer wanted a formal meeting, not a phone call, not a preliminary review, a meeting, an actual business presentation, the kind of meeting that could change everything. I nearly cried when she told me. After the call ended, I sat alone in the garage, smiling. For years, I had dreamed about moments like this. Now they were happening. Real opportunities. Real growth. Real success. Unfortunately, Richard overheard part of the conversation. And that changed everything. The next morning, he appeared unusually cheerful. That alone felt suspicious. Richard Elliott was not naturally cheerful, especially lately. At breakfast, he poured coffee and smiled. Big meeting coming up? I looked up cautiously. Maybe. His smile remained. That's exciting. The friendliness felt forced. Manufactured? Like a salesperson following a script. I said nothing. Richard continued. You know, I was thinking, again, in dangerous words. What? I should probably attend. I blinked. Attend what? The buyer meeting. For a moment. I honestly thought he was joking. Then I realized he wasn't. You want to attend my meeting? Richard nodded. Of course. The confidence in his voice stunned me. Sure. As if the idea were completely reasonable. As if he belonged there. As if he had helped build any of this. I stared at him, unable to believe what I was hearing. Why? His answer came immediately. Because we're married. I laughed, a short, humorless laugh. That's not an answer. Richard's smile faded. It's business. No, I shook my head. It's my business. The room became silent. Dangerously silent. For the first time, I saw genuine irritation flash across his face. I've spent decades building companies, I nodded, and I can help. There it was. The justification, the rationalization, the excuse, but I knew the truth. This wasn't about helping. This was about relevance, no control, access. Richard's company was collapsing. Mine was growing, and he couldn't stand being left behind. A few days later, things escalated. I received a call from Ethan Parker. His voice sounded unusual, concerned. Deborah, immediately. My stomach tightened. What happened? I just received an email. Fear shot through me. What kind of email? Silence. Then from Richard. I closed my eyes. Of course he had. What did it say? Ethan hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. He introduced himself as your strategic partner. For several seconds, I couldn't speak. Strategic partner. The phrase echoed in my head. My hands began shaking. Not from fear. From anger. Pure anger. Because this wasn't confusion. This wasn't misunderstanding. It was deliberate. Richard was inserting himself into something he hadn't built. Something he hadn't supported. Something he had actively mocked. I apologized to Ethan immediately. Over and over. Fortunately, Ethan remained professional. Don't worry. But I did worry. Because boundaries matter. And Richard had just crossed another one. That afternoon, I drove directly to Melissa's office. When I explained the situation, her expression darkened. Do you have documentation showing sole ownership? I nodded. Good. She opened a folder, then smiled for the first time that day. Because we've already prepared for this. Inside were documents. Registration records, ownership certificates, banking records, corporate filings, everything proving the truth. Elliott HomeSense belonged to Deborah Elliott. Not Richard Elliott, not both of us. Me, just me. For the first time in weeks, I felt relief. Real relief. A few days later, the buyer meeting finally arrived. I was nervous, excited, terrified, and determined. When I entered the conference room, Ethan greeted me warmly. Several executives sat around the table. Catherine was there as well. Everything felt professional, optimistic, promising. Then the door opened, and Richard walked in. My heart nearly stopped. For one terrible moment, I couldn't breathe. He had actually come. Without permission, without invitation, without warning. Richard smiled confidently, as if he belonged there, as if he owned the room. as if he owned my success. Then Ethan stood, calmly, professionally, and placed a folder on the table. The same legal documentation Melissa had prepared. The same documentation proving ownership. The same documentation proving Richard had absolutely no role in the company. I watched realization spread across Richard's face. Slowly, painfully, publicly, for the first time, he wasn't the most important person in the room, and everyone knew it. I had never seen Richard embarrassed in public before. Not truly embarrassed. Annoyed. Yes, angry often. Humiliated, never. At least not until that meeting. The moment Ethan Parker placed the ownership documents on the conference table, the atmosphere changed. Everyone in the room remained professional. Nobody mocked Richard. Nobody laughed. Nobody pointed fingers. That somehow made it worse, because the facts spoke for themselves. The documents clearly showed that Elliott HomeSense belonged entirely to me. Every filing, every registration, every bank account, every legal record. There was no partnership, no shared ownership, no executive role, no involvement whatsoever. Richard stared at the paperwork, then at Ethan, then at me. For a moment, he looked completely lost. The confident executive who once controlled every room suddenly had nothing to say. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. Mr. Elliott, we appreciate your interest. Interest. Not partnership. Not leadership. Interest. A carefully chosen word. The distinction mattered. Everyone knew it. Richard nodded stiffly, then gathered himself. Years of executive experience helped him recover quickly, but not completely. The damage was done. A few minutes later, he left the meeting without another word, without looking at me, without looking at anyone. The door closed behind him. The room became quiet. Then Catherine spoke. Shall we continue? And we did. For the next 2 hours, we discussed growth strategies, production capacity, distribution logistics, and future opportunities. For the first time in my life, I sat at a conference table not as someone's wife, not as a guest, not as a spectator, as a business owner, a decision maker, a founder. The feeling was almost overwhelming. When the meeting ended, Ethan shook my hand. We're excited about this partnership. I smiled. Genuinely smiled. Not the forced smile I had worn for years. A real one. Because I had earned that moment. Not Richard. Not anyone else. Me. But while my business continued moving forward, Richard's world was collapsing faster than ever. 3 weeks later, the official bankruptcy filing arrived. I learned about it the same way everyone else did. Through the news, Columbus Packaging Group had filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. The headline spread quickly. Local news, business publications, industry websites. The story was everywhere. And for the first time, Richard couldn't hide behind vague explanations. The crisis was public. Official, documented, real. That evening, he came home looking exhausted. More exhausted than I had ever seen him. His shoulders slumped. His face looked older. His confidence seemed gone. Yet, even then, he refused to talk about it. At least at first. I stood in the kitchen while he silently poured himself a drink. Finally, I asked, "Is it true?" Richard stared at the glass, then nodded. Just once. The gesture felt strangely heartbreaking, not because of the bankruptcy, because it was the first honest answer he had given me in months. Yes, nothing more. Just yes. The silence that followed felt enormous. For years, Richard had built his identity around success. Now that identity was cracking apart, and neither of us knew what remained underneath. A week later, things became even worse. Melissa called. Her voice was serious. "Deborah, I need you to come in. Immediately." My stomach tightened. "What's wrong?" "The bankruptcy proceedings have begun." I sat down. "And I think you need to hear this in person." That answer frightened me. The next morning, I arrived at her office. Several folders waited on the conference table. Melissa looked calm, focused, prepared, the way she always did. I sat across from her. "What happened?" She opened one of the folders. Richard's bankruptcy filing triggered additional reviews. I nodded slowly. "And," Melissa slid a document toward me. "The financing agreements are being examined." My pulse accelerated. The agreements, the collateral, the signatures, everything. I already knew where this was heading. "What did they find?" Melissa held my gaze. "Questions." The word sounded simple, but I knew better. Questions from lawyers become investigations. Investigations become evidence. Evidence becomes consequences. She continued. "Several parties want clarification regarding your involvement." I laughed bitterly. My involvement. Exactly. Because there wasn't any. That was the problem. The paperwork claimed involvement. Reality didn't. Melissa opened another folder. "The forged signature issue is becoming important." Hearing the words out loud still shocked me. Forged signature. Even now, part of me struggled to accept it, because acknowledging it meant acknowledging something even more painful. The man I married had been willing to deceive me. Legally. Financially. Deliberately. "What happens next?" I asked. Melissa's expression remained serious. "That depends." "On what?" "How aggressively the court wants to investigate." The answer lingered between us. Heavy. Uncomfortable. Real. Several weeks later, I attended my first bankruptcy hearing. The experience felt surreal. Courtrooms had always belonged to television shows, movies, other people's lives, not mine. Yet there I was, sitting quietly inside a courtroom while lawyers discussed decisions that affected my future. The room was filled with creditors, former business partners, attorneys, financial representatives, people whose lives had been damaged by Richard's collapse. For the first time, I began understanding the true scale of the disaster. This wasn't merely a failing company. It was a chain reaction. Employees had lost jobs. Vendors had lost money. Families had been affected. Businesses had suffered. The consequences extended far beyond Richard. Then I saw Linda Foster. She was sitting several rows ahead, calm, prepared, carrying a thick binder. When our eyes met, she gave me a small nod. The gesture somehow comforted me. Because by then, very few things did. The hearing lasted hours. Financial reports were discussed, debt obligations reviewed, assets examined, liabilities questioned. Everything felt complicated, overwhelming. Then Linda was called to testify. The courtroom became noticeably quieter. She walked confidently to the front, took her oath, and began speaking. Her testimony was factual, professional, precise. No emotion, no exaggeration, just facts. Yet those facts painted an ugly picture. Delayed payments, broken promises, misleading representations, questionable financial practices. Each statement seemed to make Richard smaller. Not physically, emotionally, his confidence visibly eroded. Then came Melissa's turn. My heart immediately started pounding. Because I knew what she was carrying. The documents, the signatures, the evidence, everything. She approached calmly, placed several folders before the court, and began presenting information, ownership records, business filings, financial separations, the timeline, the inconsistencies. Then finally, the signature. The courtroom remained silent as copies circulated. Nobody interrupted. Nobody reacted dramatically. The silence itself felt powerful. Because evidence doesn't need theatrics. Evidence speaks for itself. I watched the judge carefully. Judge Harold Benson had a reputation for patience, fairness, attention to detail. Throughout the hearing, he listened carefully, asked questions, took notes, observed everything. When Melissa finished, the judge studied the documents for several moments. Long moments, the kind that feel endless. Finally, he looked up. His expression was impossible to read. Then he spoke. The court finds these matters concerning. The room became completely silent. My pulse hammered in my ears. Judge Benson continued. Additional review appears warranted. Additional review. Not a final decision. Not a ruling, but something important. An opening, a beginning, an investigation. I looked toward Richard. His face had gone pale. For the first time since this nightmare began, he looked genuinely afraid. Not stressed, not frustrated, afraid. Because the story was no longer about bankruptcy. It was becoming about accountability. And deep down, I think he finally realized that. As the hearing ended and people slowly began leaving the courtroom, Melissa approached me. Her expression remained calm, professional. But there was something else there too. Confidence. We did the right thing. I nodded slowly. Because for the first time in a very long time, I believed that was true. The truth was finally catching up to Richard, and no amount of charm, authority, or excuses could stop it now. The night Richard finally told me the truth was colder than usual. Winter had arrived in Columbus. The trees outside our house stood bare against a gray sky. The wind rattled the windows. And for the first time in 35 years, I felt like a stranger living beside my own husband. The weeks following the bankruptcy hearing had been brutal. For Richard. For me. For everyone connected to his company. The investigation ordered by Judge Benson was moving forward. Lawyers were asking questions. Creditors wanted answers. Former business partners were becoming less patient. Every day seemed to bring another problem. Another document. Another revelation. Meanwhile, Elliott HomeSense continued growing. The national distribution opportunity was progressing. Nothing was finalized yet. But for the first time, I could genuinely see a future beyond survival. A future built on something I had created. The contrast between our lives had become impossible to ignore. One business was expanding. The other was collapsing. One future was opening. The other was closing. And neither of us knew how to talk about it anymore. That evening, I was sitting alone in the garage reviewing inventory reports. The familiar scent of lavender and vanilla surrounded me. Normally, it calmed me. Tonight, it didn't. My mind felt restless, exhausted, heavy. The sound of the garage door opening pulled me from my thoughts. I looked up. Richard stood in the doorway. For a moment, I barely recognized him. Not because he looked different, because something was missing. The confidence, the arrogance, the certainty, all gone. He looked tired, genuinely tired. Not physically, emotionally. Like a man carrying more weight than he could manage. Neither of us spoke. The silence stretched between us. Then he stepped inside. I need to talk to you. The words immediately made my stomach tighten, because Richard never said things like that. Not sincerely, not vulnerably, not ever. I closed my laptop. Okay. For several moments, he simply stood there, as though he didn't know where to begin. That alone felt shocking. Richard always knew what to say, always controlled conversations, always directed them. Tonight seemed different. Finally, he sat down across from me. The same chair where I had packed orders for years. The same chair he had once mocked. The irony wasn't lost on me. I messed up. The words were so unexpected that I wasn't sure I heard them correctly. What? Richard looked down at his hands, then repeated himself. I messed up. The room became silent. In 35 years of marriage, I could count on one hand the number of times Richard had admitted being wrong. This felt unprecedented. I waited. Eventually, he continued. The company. His voice cracked slightly. The decisions. Another pause. The debt. I said nothing. For once, I wanted him to keep talking. Without interruption. Without excuses. Without rescue. And surprisingly, he did. For nearly an hour, Richard told me things he had never admitted before. How the lost contracts had damaged cash flow. How he ignored warnings from senior managers. How he believed his reputation would protect him. How he convinced himself every problem was temporary. How each bad decision forced another bad decision. Listening to him felt surreal. Because, for years, Richard had presented himself as the smartest person in every room. Now he was describing mistake after mistake. Failure after failure. Pride after pride. Eventually, he stopped speaking. The silence returned. Then I asked the question that had been haunting me for months. Why did you treat me the way you did? His eyes slowly lifted toward mine. For a moment, I thought he might avoid the question. Instead, he surprised me. I was jealous. I blinked. Certain I had misunderstood. What? Richard laughed softly. A sad laugh. The kind people make when they finally admit something painful. I was jealous. The words felt impossible. Richard Elliott, jealous of me. The idea seemed absurd, yet he continued. The more successful your business became. His voice trailed off, then resumed. The more I hated looking at it. I stared at him, trying to understand, trying to connect the confession to the man I thought I knew. Why? The answer came quietly. Because, for the first time in years, Richard wasn't trying to impress anyone, not even himself. Because you were succeeding. The simplicity of the statement somehow made it more devastating. I waited. He continued. My entire life was built around being the provider. I nodded slowly. I know. It was who I was. Another pause. The successful one. The words hung heavily in the air. Then came the truth. The real truth. When your company started growing. His eyes drifted toward the shelves surrounding us. I realized something. I didn't speak. I simply listened. Richard swallowed hard. You didn't need me. The sentence hit me unexpectedly. Not because it was true, because it revealed how he saw our marriage. Need, dependence, control, somewhere along the way. He had confused being valued with being necessary. And when that necessity disappeared, he panicked. The realization saddened me more than I expected. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then I asked another question. The dinner party. His eyes closed briefly. I already knew he remembered. You laughed at me. Richard nodded. Slowly, painfully. Yes. Why? The answer came almost immediately. Because he had clearly asked himself the same question many times. I wanted everyone to keep seeing me as the important one. The honesty stunned me. No excuses. No blame. No justification. Just truth. Ugly truth. But truth. For the first time all night, I felt something shift inside me. Not forgiveness. Not yet. Understanding. The two are not the same thing. I understood why he had done it. That didn't erase the damage. Eventually, Richard leaned forward. His expression changed. The vulnerability disappeared, replaced by desperation. And suddenly, I knew exactly where the conversation was going. Before he even spoke. Deborah. There it was. The request. The reason for the visit. The reason for the honesty. The reason for the confession. I felt my heart sink. Because deep down, I already knew. What? Richard hesitated, then finally said it. I need help. Of course. I closed my eyes briefly. Not from anger. From disappointment. Because for one moment, I had allowed myself to believe this conversation was about accountability, about healing, about truth. Instead, we had arrived here at money again. How much? The question escaped before I could stop it. Richard looked embarrassed, ashamed, and desperate, all at once. A lot. I laughed softly, not because anything was funny, because the answer felt inevitable. What exactly are you asking? His voice became almost pleading. The investigation, the creditors, the attorneys. He took a deep breath. If I can stabilize things. I stared at him, waiting. Then he finally said the words, I need access to some of your business capital. The garage became silent, painfully silent. Every emotion I had felt throughout the evening suddenly made sense. The confession, the honesty, the vulnerability, all of it had led here, to a request, to rescue, to salvation. And for the first time, so I understood something clearly. Richard wasn't sitting in front of me because he finally saw my worth. He was sitting in front of me because he finally needed it. There was a difference. A very important difference. As I looked at the man I had loved for 35 years, a deep sadness settled over me. Because the truth had finally arrived. And the truth was heartbreaking. Richard wasn't asking for forgiveness. He wasn't asking for reconciliation. He wasn't asking for another chance. He was asking for money. And in that moment, I realized our marriage might already be over. I didn't answer Richard that night. Not immediately. After 35 years of marriage, I owed myself at least one thing. Time. Time to think. Time to breathe. Time to separate sympathy from responsibility. Because those two things are not the same. I sat alone in the garage long after Richard went upstairs. The shelves around me were filled with products that had changed my life. Candles, soaps, gift boxes, things that had once seemed small, things my husband had laughed at. Now they represented something much bigger. Freedom. For the first time, I allowed myself to ask a question I had been avoiding for months. What did I actually want? Not what Richard wanted, not what our children would think, not what society expected. What did Deborah Elliott want? The answer came more quickly than I expected. Peace. I wanted peace. The realization felt both simple and heartbreaking. Because peace had been missing from my life for a very long time. The next morning, Richard found me drinking coffee in the kitchen. His eyes immediately searched my face, looking for hope, looking for an answer, looking for rescue. I remained calm. I thought about what you said. He sat down across from me, waiting. I took a slow breath, then spoke carefully. I'm not giving you money. The words hung in the air, heavy, final. For a moment, Richard didn't react. Then I watched disappointment wash across his face. Not surprise, disappointment, as if some part of him had still expected me to save him. You don't understand. The sentence irritated me immediately. Because I understood perfectly. For years, Richard had confused disagreement with misunderstanding. Anyone who challenged him simply didn't understand. Not this time. No, Richard. I held his gaze. I understand exactly what's happening. Silence. You made choices. More silence. You ignored warnings. His jaw tightened. You used our savings. The tension grew. You used my business. Still, he said nothing. You forged documents. That was the one that finally landed. The one he couldn't argue with. The one he couldn't explain away. For several seconds, he simply stared at the table. Then he nodded. Slowly, painfully. The gesture somehow hurt more than any argument. Because it was an admission. And admissions arrive too late more often than people realize. Eventually, Richard stood. Without another word. Without anger. Without shouting, he simply walked away. For the first time, I saw what defeat looked like. And strangely, it didn't make me feel victorious, only sad. Over the following weeks, our relationship became quieter than ever. Not hostile, not dramatic, quiet. Like two people slowly drifting toward different shores. The bankruptcy case continued. The investigation continued. The lawyers continued. Life moved forward, and so did I. The national distribution agreement was finalized shortly afterward. I still remember the moment Ethan called. I was standing in the garage, exactly where my journey had begun. When he delivered the news, I cried. Not because of money, not because of success, because someone believed in what I had built. The little business Richard had mocked was now entering stores across the country. The irony wasn't lost on me. Neither was the lesson. Success doesn't arrive when other people believe in you. It arrives when you keep going long enough to believe in yourself. A month later, I met with Melissa. The conversation wasn't about business, or bankruptcy, or legal documents. It was about divorce. Even now, writing those words feels strange. Divorce. After 35 years, I never imagined my life would take that path. Not once. Not even during our worst arguments. Yet the truth had become impossible to ignore. Trust was gone. Respect was gone. Partnership was gone. What remained was history. And history alone isn't enough to sustain a marriage. Melissa listened quietly as I explained my decision. When I finished, she nodded. You sound certain. I thought about that, then smiled softly. For the first time in a long time, I am. The paperwork began shortly afterward. The process wasn't dramatic. No screaming matches, no courtroom battles, no scenes from television. Just two people acknowledging a reality neither could change. The marriage had ended long before the paperwork began. The documents simply made it official. Several months later, I moved into a smaller home on the outskirts of Columbus. It wasn't luxurious. It wasn't grand, but it was mine. Every room felt peaceful. Every morning felt lighter. For the first time in decades, I could hear my own thoughts. I could make decisions without criticism, celebrate successes without dismissal, dream without permission. The freedom felt unfamiliar. Then wonderful. Meanwhile, Elliott HomeSense continued growing. New retail partnerships emerged. Customer demand increased. A small team became a larger team. The company that once fit inside a garage now occupied a professional workspace. Sometimes I would walk through the building and pause, just to take it all in. The employees, the products, the activity, the energy, and every single time, I remembered the dinner party, the laughter, the humiliation. The moment Richard had called it a cute little business, not because I wanted revenge, because I needed the reminder. The reminder that other people's opinions are often reflections of their limitations, not yours. One afternoon, Sarah visited the new office. She slowly walked through the building, taking everything in. Finally, she turned toward me. "You know something." "What?" She smiled. "You've become an inspiration around town." I laughed. "No, I haven't." "Yes, you have." She wasn't joking. Apparently, local business groups had begun sharing my story. Women's organizations invited me to speak. Entrepreneurs asked for advice. People wanted to know how I started, how I grew, how I kept going. The attention felt strange, but I understood why. People weren't inspired by candles. They were inspired by resilience, by second chances, by reinvention, especially later in life. One evening, after everyone had gone home, I sat alone in my office. The building was quiet. Outside, the sun was setting. Golden light streamed through the windows. I thought about the woman I used to be, the woman who needed Richard's approval, the woman who doubted herself, the woman who believed it was too late to start over. She felt so far away now, yet she was still part of me. The reason I had made it here. The reason I had survived. The reason I finally understood something important. You don't need permission to become who you were meant to be, and you certainly don't need approval. As I looked around the office one final time before heading home, a feeling settled over me. Not triumph, not revenge. Something better, freedom. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't living as Richard Elliott's wife. I was living as Deborah Elliott, and that was more than enough. 8 months after I moved out of the house I had shared with Richard for more than 3 decades, I found myself standing in the middle of a national retail conference in Chicago. If someone had told me a few years earlier that I would be there as the founder of a growing brand, I would have laughed. Not because it was impossible, because I wouldn't have believed I deserved it. The convention center was enormous. Thousands of people moved through the building. Retail buyers, business owners, industry leaders, entrepreneurs. For most of my life, rooms like that belonged to other people. Confident people, important people, successful people. Now, I was one of them. That realization still felt strange. A large display featuring Elliott HomeSense stood near the center of the exhibition floor. Professional signage, product displays, branded packaging. Everything looked polished and beautiful. Every time I saw the company name, I remembered the garage, the shelves, the late nights, the doubts, the tears, the laughter, especially the laughter. Not because it still hurt, because it reminded me how far I had come. As the event continued, dozens of people stopped by our booth. Some were existing partners, others were potential buyers. Several wanted photographs. A few wanted advice. The experience felt surreal. At one point, Catherine appeared beside me. She studied the display quietly, then smiled. "You did this," I laughed. "We did this." She shook her head. "No," her voice became gentle. "I opened a door." She pointed toward the display. "You walked through it." For a moment, emotion caught in my throat. Because she was right. Catherine had helped me, guided me, believed in me, but she couldn't have done the work for me. Nobody could. The work had always been mine. The same way the success was mine. The same way the mistakes were mine. Ownership works both ways. That was something Richard never understood. Late that afternoon, the unexpected happened. I was speaking with a buyer when I noticed someone standing near the edge of the booth, watching quietly, waiting. My heart stopped for a moment. Richard? He looked older, much older. The previous year had clearly taken its toll. His hair was grayer, his face thinner, his posture less confident. The difference wasn't dramatic, but it was noticeable. Life had changed him. The buyer eventually walked away, leaving us alone. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Richard smiled. A small smile, tired, uncertain, not the smile of a man who expected to control the conversation. The smile of a man hoping for kindness. "Hello, Deborah," I smiled politely. "Hello, Richard." The exchange felt strange. Two people who had once shared everything, now speaking like distant acquaintances. He looked around the booth, at the products, the displays, the customers, the employees, the success, everything he once dismissed. "It's impressive," I laughed softly. "You've said that before." A faint smile appeared on his face. I deserved that. The honesty surprised me. We stood quietly for a moment. Then Richard sighed. "I wasn't sure you'd want to see me." I considered the statement carefully, then answered honestly. "I wasn't sure either." That made him laugh, a genuine laugh. The first one I had heard from him in a long time. The bitterness was gone. The arrogance, too. Only the man remained. For several minutes, we talked, not about lawyers, not about bankruptcy, not about blame, just life. Simple things, ordinary things. The conversation felt unexpectedly peaceful. Then Richard looked around once more. His eyes settled on the company logo. Elliott Home Sense. For a moment, he simply stared. Then he spoke quietly. "You really did it." The words carried no jealousy, no resentment, no bitterness. Only recognition. And somehow, that mattered. Not because I needed his approval. I didn't. That chapter of my life was over. It mattered because it was the first time he acknowledged the truth. Completely. Without qualification. without dismissal, without trying to make himself bigger. I nodded. Yes, Richard swallowed, then looked at me, directly. The way he should have years ago. I'm sorry. The words were simple, yet they carried more weight than any speech. More weight than any excuse. More weight than any explanation. For several seconds, I didn't respond, not because I was angry, because I was remembering the dinner party, the laughter, the humiliation, the years of feeling small, the years of doubting myself, the years spent chasing approval that never came. Eventually, I smiled, a genuine smile, and something unexpected happened. I realized I wasn't angry anymore, not at all. The resentment was gone. Not because Richard deserved forgiveness, because I deserved peace. There is a difference. People often think forgiveness is a gift we give someone else. Sometimes it's a gift we give ourselves. I know, I said softly. Richard nodded. His eyes briefly filled with emotion. Then he looked away. We stood there, quietly. Two people connected by a lifetime of memories. A lifetime that had not ended the way either of us imagined. Finally, Richard spoke again. You know what's funny? I smiled. What? He glanced at the display. Then back at me. The thing I was most afraid of wasn't losing the company. That surprised me. What was it? His answer came immediately. Losing myself. I studied him. And for the first time, I believed him, because Richard's company had never truly been the problem. His pride had been, the company simply exposed it. The same way my success exposed mine. We all have things we hide behind. Titles, money, status, relationships. The danger comes when we mistake those things for who we are. Richard had spent decades doing exactly that. Then life took them away. Painfully, publicly, and he had been forced to discover who remained. Eventually, he extended his hand. I looked at it, then shook it. A strange ending, yet somehow the right one. No dramatic reunion, no reconciliation, no fairy tale ending, just respect. The thing that had been missing all along. A few minutes later, Richard walked away. Disappearing into the crowd, I watched him go, then turned back toward my booth, toward my future, toward the life I had built. For a long moment, I stood there looking at everything around me. The employees, the customers, the products, the opportunities. And suddenly, I thought back to the night of the dinner party. The moment Richard laughed. The moment everyone else laughed too. For years, I believed that moment represented humiliation, failure, rejection. Ugh. Now I saw it differently. That moment had been a beginning. The beginning of the life I was supposed to build. The beginning of the woman I was supposed to become. The woman standing here now. Confident, independent, peaceful, and finally free. The truth is, Richard Elliott laughed at my small business. Then his company went bankrupt first. But that isn't really the story. The story is that a woman who spent decades doubting herself finally discovered her own worth. And once she did, nobody could take it away again.